poison of empire runs through the veins of many people. Nostalgia. What is that? A sentimental longing, a tenderness or sadness for lost familiar objects, a melancholy yearning for the past. Nostalgia influenced hearts and minds that led to a shock event that started with a gentle and serene journey of misinformation and deception, eventually slamming into a public so craven.
Well, at 20 minutes to 5, we can now say the decision taken in 1975 by this country to join the common market has been reversed by this referendum to leave the EU. We are absolutely clear now that there is no way that the Remain side can win. It looks as though the gap's going to be something like 52 to 48, so a 4-point lead for leaving the EU. And that's the result of this referendum, which has been preceded by weeks and months of argument and dispute and all the rest of it. The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
It is argued that one of the main reasons for the successful Leave vote was a nostalgia for pre-European Union Britain. But what was that? Was it empire? Was it Britain pulling through after the war? Was it a nostalgia for when Britain was the most powerful nation on earth? Was it Britannia rules the waves? There is, of course, an argument that the vote was against capital and neoliberal political philosophies of free trade and the free movement of people, as foreseen, though not predicted, in Fisher's Capital Realism, a failure to recognise the ever-expanding gap between the rich and poor, us and them. Was there a place for Britain to fit within this European group of nations, to actually have an identity? After all, Britain, in particular England, has never been a country. It's been a union, an empire, and then a union again, but never a country. In his book, This Is Not Propaganda, author Peter Pomerantsev draws from Boehm's two definitions of nostalgia, one of which is described as a restorative nostalgia, a damaging nostalgia that strives to rebuild lost homelands with paranoid determination, thinks of itself as true and tradition, obsesses over grand symbols and relinquishes critical thinking for emotional bonding. Unreflective nostalgia can breed monsters.
Where there are no 10 commandments, and a man can raise a first. For the temple bells are calling, and it's there that I would be, by the old Moulmein Pagoda.
I think that perhaps these monsters do exist in all our minds, be it conscious or subconsciously. I, for one, know the anger I feel towards the Brexit vote. It's a conscious thing, perhaps Jungian, ego mixed with the subconscious. Jackson Pollock drew from monsters in his mind. McLagan suggests Pollock was drawn to the depths of Jungian theory. I have a monster in my head, a rage that is expressed when I am drawing, but it's an anger directed towards unreflective nostalgia, an anger towards colonial Britain's past as being great. I don't think that, but I do think back to my childhood in the 60s and 70s, how we were brainwashed with great deeds of empire. When I reflect on the area I live, I see other kinds of nostalgia, referring again to Pomerantsev's reflection on the words of Boehm's, a reflective nostalgia. I see flags fluttering proudly in the wind, mostly in the grounds of homes that reflect a certain amount of wealth and security. perhaps reflecting a nostalgia that tries to tease out the difference between the past and present to formulate the future. But for some it can be read differently as restorative. This cottage previously had daubed on its walls, "Free Tommy Robinson, Tommy Robinson is innocent." The text next to a Brexit Leave banner and the Union flag and the flag of St. George perhaps speaks of the poison of empire could still run through their veins. I see my work as an expression of anger towards a restorative nostalgia. The British Empire was built on the slave trade and the exploitation and neglect of its own working classes. One such example was recently reenacted in Mike Leigh's film Peterloo. The America's colonial trade is depicted in the brutal J.M.W. Turner's oil painting, The Slave Ship. The painting was the basis for Carl Walker's Grub for Sharks. Coming across this connection in Anthony Downey's book Art and Politics Now reminded me of my first encounter with Walker's work at the Maxi in Rome. The Emancipation Approximation. Her work references the biggest legacy of colonisation, as does the monolithic Fons Americanus. Drawing on that legacy, the legacy being slavery, genocide and exploitation, famine and repatriation, also seen here in works by Australian Aboriginal artist Gordon Bennett and the Bangladeshi artist Zainal Abidin. Previously mentioned, Mike Leigh's film Peterloo references the suppression of the working classes, set in the time period known as Pax Britannica. Another example of exploitation and neglect of the British Empire, the Irish potato famine, the Highland clearances, and the Aberfan disaster. When I draw, sometimes from the mind, sometimes from the found image, and sometimes from my own photographs, there is an angst to the mark-making, layers and layers of it, which I explode into an abstraction of red, white and blue. Frank Bowling uses abstraction and the colours of his Caribbean heritage to explode, to tell tales of his experience of a colonial upbringing. He arrived in Britain as part of the Windrush generation. I see the legacy of his work directly pointing towards that of empire, the poison it is, his pinks and greens. The beauty in his large-scale canvases are so subversive. Rebecca Partridge, although a different kind of abstract artist to me, paints from the landscape, I from the mind. Partridge said in a recent talk I attended, "Painting is a record of activity and a response to time and the present." I absolutely relate to that. My sketches and the abstraction of them are a response to the times we are in now, abstractions of my mind, my environment, my history. These sketches talk of my history, also of surveillance, the faceless watcher, the voyeuristic algorithms that record our every move, then bombarding us with the post-truth narrative that justifies our prejudice, that promote a restorative nostalgia. Most people in Britain think the British Empire was a good thing. In an article published under the title Global Britain and the Narrative of Empire, the author quotes a 2016 poll. 43% thought the empire was a good thing, 25% thought it was neither good or bad, 19% thought the empire was a bad thing. Only one poll, I admit, but those who would be supportive of the campaign to leave the EU would have been bombarded with online, jingoistic and nationalistic propaganda about how Great Britain was in the past and how bad it's been since the end of empire. In Hart's article for Anthropology Today, the author highlights some of the respect and nostalgia held by some for the British Empire, with quotes such like, "The empire ran according to principles of truth, justice and honesty." Alternatively, those erring towards a Remain view would be bombarded with an opposite narrative. Most of us want to engage with a narrative or dialogue that we agree with, one that reinforces our own particular prejudice. But what is the truth, and what are lies? The same can be said for painting in abstraction. What is the truth in the mark-making? In his book Line Let Loose, Scribbling, Doodling and Automatic Drawing, McLachlan asks questions about the conscious mark-making and the subconscious mark-making. Referring to automatic drawing, McLachlan quotes abstract expressionist painter Aghazian. "It took me 5 years before I was able to create purely automatically," he says. So it begs the question, is a conscious mark a mark to deceive, a fake mark, or is it the truth that becomes a lie? Is a subconscious mark the truth that then becomes a lie? The use of abstraction in my painting is a response to the post-truth era. It cites my work in the present.